discovery. February 8th, 1900, the Eastman Kodak Company introduces a simple cardboard box camera to the world called the Brownie. Named after elf characters from a popular series of children's books, the Brownie makes taking pictures easy. So easy, even children can take a charming photograph. In the beginning, photographic procedure had been costly, cumbersome, and complicated. A series of inventions simplified picture taking, but the Brownie was the first inexpensive, easy-to-use camera. Anyone could click and take a picture. Back in 1839, French inventor Louis Daguerre discovered that mercury vapors could develop an image from a sensitized plate exposed to light. His daguerreotypes launched the age of photography and quickly became a sensation. Unlike paintings or lithographs, a daguerreotype was an exact likeness of the subject. To record themselves for posterity, thousands of individuals and their families sat for the camera. But daguerreotypes were no quick and simple snapshot. They were one-of-a-kind positive images that could not produce multiple pictures. To prepare the silver-coated copper sheets, load the camera, and develop the plate required skill, patience, and hours of labor. The poor person who sat for the portrait had to hold a pose for up to 20 minutes, his head affixed to clamps. Any movement caused a blur. No wonder the subject never risked the torture of holding a 20-minute smile. By mid-century, a new photographic process was invented, the collodion or wet plate process, which produced a negative and so an unlimited number of prints. Glass plates were replaced with tin, a cheaper and stronger material, and the resulting prints were called tintypes. Tintypes were less costly than daguerreotypes, and soon tent businesses sprang up near beaches and carnivals. Inside each tent, photographers coated their plates with a wet, gluey collodion, took their picture in the sunlight, then quickly developed the exposed wet plate before it dried. In 1860, a photographer named Matthew Brady opened a gallery in New York City and began taking portraits of well-known subjects like presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln. Brady sold thousands of prints of this popular photograph. Then, when the Civil War broke out, Brady sent teams of photographers to the battlefields to document for the public the first grim scenes of war. Not far from the cannon fire of Bull Run, Antietam, and Appomattox, Brady parked his wagons, the mobile darkrooms where he prepared and developed his wet plates. His exposure times were short, only fractions of a minute, but still too long to capture action. So he selected scenes and subjects able to hold a pose, usually before or after a battle. By the end of the war, men like Matthew Brady's assistant, Timothy O'Sullivan, turned to the West and began taking exquisite landscape photographs. Then, in 1871, with the discovery of gelatin and the dry plate process, photographers no longer had to travel with darkrooms, but developed their plates hours, even days after taking a picture. The dry plate was so light sensitive, it required a mere fraction of a second exposure and could capture action. George Eastman was a bank clerk and an amateur photographer in Rochester, New York in 1880, when he began to manufacture and sell dry plates. But he was put off by the large cameras and the tedious development process. In the interest of enticing non-professionals, Eastman made it his mission to build a simple, affordable camera. His first innovation was rolled paper negative film. Then, in 1888, he developed a box camera, the Kodak, a name he chose because it was short and could not be mispronounced. Portable, easier to use than anything before, the Kodak took what Eastman called snapshots. His customers sent their cameras to Eastman's factory in Rochester, where the film was unloaded, developed, and printed. Then the camera was reloaded and returned to its owner, ready for use. But the Kodak was only the start. At $25, it was not accessible to most consumers. Eastman was determined to build a camera suitable for mass production. In February 1900, the Brownie was unveiled, a cardboard box with a wooden film carrier. At a price of only $1, the Brownie was advertised to attract children, whom Eastman shrewdly knew would soon grow up to buy cameras and, of course, film. To reach the younger users, Eastman displayed his modest little box with Brownie elves from the pages of popular storybooks by Palmer Cox. Plant the Brownie acorn, Eastman said, and the Kodak oak will grow. And grow it did. On the first run, the Rochester plant turned out 5,000 Brownies, and they sold immediately. 10, then 20,000 more were built, and shops could not keep them stocked. The Brownie found its way into millions of households, and through the years until the 1980s, Kodak released nearly 100 different models under the Brownie name. George Eastman had built a reliable, inexpensive camera even children could use. And many a successful photographer today attributes his start to the Kodak Brownie. The Boxer Rebellion became the first major war to erupt in the new century. Hostilities that had been simmering for decades exploded when China declared war against the foreign powers of France, Russia, England, Japan, Austria, Italy, Germany, and the United States. The beginning of the 20th century found the 2,000-year-old Chinese empire in decline. Foreign powers descended like vultures on what was left of the dying Manchu dynasty. The once powerful Chinese people fumed as they saw their land and protectorates taken over by foreigners. Hong Kong and Burma were lost to England, Korea to Japan, and Vietnam to France. As the power structure within the Manchu court struggled to maintain its tenuous control within China, foreign encroachment intensified internal political conflicts. What had been an ancient closed society was threatened by the corruption of progress and foreign influence. The Chinese became distrustful of foreigners and were greatly concerned by the influx of Christian missionaries who converted an increasing number of Chinese to an alien religion. A campaign of terror had begun the previous year when a secret organization called the Boxers began killing Christian missionaries and their converts in the northern provinces of China. The Boxers were a clandestine social society that had been in existence since the early 1700s. The group preached a mixture of Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist ideas and was rabidly opposed to any change in ancient culture. Members practiced a form of shadow boxing and believed that followers of the cult were invulnerable. In May of 1900, the Boxers killed 4 French and Belgian railway engineers. This was followed by the murder of the Japanese chancellor in Peking. The foreign powers responded by sending ships and troops to China. The imperial court had initially condemned the Boxer violence and had sent government troops to quell the uprising. But the ruling Dowager Empress, Cixi, was eventually won over to the Boxer cause as a result of foreign attacks on Chinese forts, and the rumor that the foreign powers wanted to return her deposed nephew to power. On June 20th, the Boxers invaded Peking, brandishing spears topped with the heads of murdered missionaries. They laid siege to the foreign legations, where almost 1,000 foreigners and 3,000 Chinese Christians had taken refuge. On August 4th, an international force of 20,000 headed for Peking to rescue the besieged legations. Although the Boxer troops in the Peking area were estimated at 360,000, the international force broke through the lines after 2 weeks of heavy fighting. 54 days after the siege began, the foreign legation was rescued. The imperial court fled Peking, and the Boxers were eventually forced to surrender. The Boxer Rebellion revealed to the people the basic weakness and ineptitude of the Manchu dynasty. It opened the floodgates of modern Chinese nationalism that 12 years later would sweep the dynasty into history. The war shifted the internal power structure in China and increased Chinese resentment of foreigners. This set the stage for the rise of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Revolution. January 22nd, 1901, bells were tolling throughout Britain, but the implications could be felt throughout Europe and the world. Queen Victoria had died, and with her, an era. Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in English history, holding the throne for 63 years. The world would undergo many changes during her lifetime, but through it all, the British Empire would continue to grow and prosper, becoming the empire on which the sun never set. Victoria was born in 1819. She described her childhood as lonely and unhappy, and was only 18 when she inherited the throne after the death of King William IV. Victoria's popularity soared in Britain after her joyous marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg. Though the courtship had first been suggested by her mother and her uncle, Victoria was immediately taken with the handsome and charming Albert, and she proposed to him on October 15th, 1839. The marriage was a happy one and resulted in Victoria taking a less partisan but more active role in politics under the influence of the more conservative Albert. Subsequent prime ministers were more often subjected to her royal opinion, and Victoria never hesitated to reveal her wishes. Another aspect of the marriage, however, had more far-reaching consequences. Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and her descendants would intermarry throughout the royal families of Europe. While government ministers had to rely on sometimes outdated reports in their handling of foreign affairs, Victoria had direct access to most of the thrones of Europe. In later years, this included her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and her granddaughter, Alexandra, wife of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. When Albert died from typhoid fever in 1861, Victoria was devastated. She went into seclusion for several years and would remain in mourning for the rest of her life. After a few years spent in seclusion, however, Victoria began to re-enter the political arena. She was particularly close to Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, whose imperialist policy she supported, and who would name her Empress of India in 1876. Less fortunate was Disraeli's successor, William Gladstone. Victoria did not like Gladstone and attempted to prevent his becoming prime minister in 1880. She would later accuse Gladstone of weakening the empire. Though prime ministers would come and go during her era, Queen Victoria was the one constant that held the empire together. She had restored the monarchy to glory at a time when it was irrevocably losing its power. After her death, monarchies across Europe would begin to crumble, and Europe would become embroiled in a series of conflicts and revolutions leading to World War I. Indeed, Victoria's funeral was one of the last great occasions on which almost all the crowned heads of Europe gathered together at the same time. Victoria's death truly marked the end of an era. The sun was finally beginning to set on the vast British Empire, and the world would never be the same. On September 6, 1901, William McKinley became the 3rd U.S. president to be cut down by an assassin's bullet. He was shot by an anarchist while greeting visitors at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Although doctors initially felt the president would recover, he developed an infection and died 8 days later. McKinley had recently been elected to his 2nd term in office. His first term had been dominated by foreign policy issues. McKinley had propelled America onto the international stage and ended a long period of U.S. isolationism. The swift and decisive U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War demonstrated his effective leadership, as did the pacification of a revolt in the new U.S. territory of the Philippines. Still, another foreign problem confronted the McKinley administration in China. The U.S. was one of many international powers vying for newly opening markets in Asia. In the subsequent Boxer Rebellion, led by Chinese opposed to Western influence, many Americans were killed. McKinley attached 5,000 U.S. troops to an international expedition that successfully rescued Western residents in China. As the convention and election of 1900 approached, McKinley's stature within the Republican Party and his popularity with Americans was high. The only significant debate within the party concerned the vice presidential nomination, as Vice President Garrett Hobart had died in 1899. Despite dissimilar personal styles, McKinley allowed the convention to choose Theodore Roosevelt as his running mate. Roosevelt brought youth and a forceful energy to the Republican ticket. He had gained a national reputation as a hero in the Spanish-American War and later became governor of New York. He was only 42 years old. McKinley won the election, receiving the largest popular majority ever given a presidential candidate up to that time. Inaugurated a second time on March 4, 1901, McKinley looked forward to a new term that would focus more on domestic issues than on foreign policy. However, 6 months later, fate intervened. William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, was dead. Within hours, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as his successor. Justice was swift for the president's assassin. As McKinley was being laid to rest, his assassin, Leon Czolgosz, was being indicted for murder. The assassin claimed that he had acted alone and believed the country needed a change of leadership. After confessing, he was convicted and sentenced to death. 7 weeks after his crime, the man who had murdered a president was sent to the electric chair. This is the actual footage of his electrocution. In the days following McKinley's death, Roosevelt took the reins of power, vowing to continue McKinley's work. Instead, he surpassed it. He reformed civil service, created the Pure Food and Drug Act, improved labor conditions, created a national conservation policy, built the Panama Canal, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and helped establish the U.S. as a preeminent world power. America was fortunate indeed to have so capable a man assume the presidency upon the death of William McKinley on September 14, 1901. December 12, 1901. Guglielmo Marconi, Italian inventor and electrical engineer, sends the first radio signals across the Atlantic from Cornwall to Newfoundland, a distance of over 2,000 miles. Months earlier, high winds had destroyed both his transmitter and receiver stations, but he was undaunted. Using rudimentary methods, he proved to the world the long-distance power, speed, and stability of radio waves. Born in 1874, Marconi was the son of an Irish mother and an Italian father. He would grow up to feel at home in both Italian and British cultures. In his childhood home, the Villa Grifoni near Bologna, Italy, young Marconi developed an ardent interest in science and read widely, including the papers of Heinrich Hertz, a German physicist who experimented with electromagnetic waves. Marconi lived in a time when wires carried telegraph messages. Yet, such wires could not be laid over vast stretches of land and sea. Ships could not be warned of bad weather, nor could they signal for help. Marconi imagined, what if electromagnetic waves, without the necessity of wires, could carry a long-distance message through the air? What if the power of radio waves could reach ships far from shore? In his attic, Marconi built a battery-powered transmitter, and in 1894, he sent the taps of the Morse code across his father's estate, a distance of over 1 mile. But in his native Italy, he found little appreciation for his invention. So, at the age of 22, he sailed to England, a nation deeply invested in maritime interests. He quickly patented his black box, and in 1896, he formed the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, later renamed the Marconi Company. In Britain, a monopoly controlled all land-based commercial message handling, so Marconi focused his efforts on ship-to-shore transmissions. Embarking on a series of signal-sending demonstrations to generate business, he soon attracted the magnates of the shipping world, the British Army, the Navy, and Lloyd's of London, who insured shippers. By 1899, he was able to send a signal 30 miles across the English Channel to Wimereux on the northern coast of France. This capped a series of shore-to-shore demonstrations that proved neither heavy fog nor stormy seas interrupted radio waves. Like many physicists of his day, Marconi thought that electromagnetic waves traveled like light in a straight line. What would happen, he wondered, when sending a signal thousands of miles beyond the horizon? Would radio waves be stopped by the curvature of the Earth? Marconi decided to find out. He announced he would try to transmit a signal across the Atlantic Ocean. In July of 1900, in Poldhu, Cornwall, he constructed a ring of masts 200 feet in diameter with transmitting aerials. But soon after it was operating, high winds ripped it apart. A similar fate befell Marconi's receiver station in Wellfleet on Cape Cod, 1 short month before he had scheduled his first transatlantic transmission. Marconi would not postpone his test. In Poldhu, he erected a fan-shaped antenna. On the North American side, he found a hilltop plateau on Signal Hill overlooking St. John's Port in Newfoundland. There, with his 2 assistants, he attached an antenna to a kite and sent it flying 400 feet up over the stormy Atlantic. On the morning of December 12, 1901, in an old abandoned hospital, Marconi took turns with his assistants listening on the earphone for signals from Cornwall. At noon, he heard 3 sharp clicks, Morse code for the letter S. A signal carried 2,137 miles, unimpeded by the Earth's curve, capable of reaching the far corners of the world. Marconi's discovery marked the dawn of the age of radio. Throughout his life, Marconi continued experimenting in radio telegraphy, and in 1909, he won the Nobel Prize. At that time, many considered wireless telegraphs aboard ships a costly luxury. But all that changed in 1912, when the Titanic sank in less than 3 hours. It was the SOS wireless message that brought a rescue ship to save over 700 passengers. In later years, Marconi's interest turned to transmitting the voice by radio, and in 1920, he began a regular news broadcast in Britain.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO Marconi House, London, calling.
Hundreds of programs soon filled the airwaves, and the world's love affair with radio was born. Just 20 years after that historic day, when Marconi received the first transatlantic radio signal. May 31st, 1902, peace was finally declared in the 3-year-long Boer War. It marked the end of a bitterly fought war between Great Britain and 2 Boer states in southern Africa. The Boers were descendants of Dutch, German, and French settlers who had controlled the land for more than 200 years. Disagreements between the Boers and the British were long-standing, but the immediate cause of the war was a demand by Britain that English immigrants living in Boer territory be naturalized and allowed to vote. These immigrants complained of many grievances under Boer rule, and they were numerous enough to outvote the Boers. Therefore, the British demand seemed tantamount to asking that Britons be given political control of the Republic. Alarmed and already distrustful of Britain, the two Boer states had formed an alliance and began increasing their armaments. In response, British territories in Africa were reinforced with thousands of additional troops from England. The mounting tensions erupted on October 12, 1899, when the Boers invaded British territory. At first, the civilian fighters were surprisingly successful against Britain's professional soldiers. They won several major battles within the first few months. The tide was turned, however, when reinforcements were sent from England. Major portions of the Boer army were defeated, and on November 29, 1900, the British proclaimed that the war was over and the Boer republics had been annexed. But the war did not end. The Boers dissolved into guerrilla bands and harassed railways and outlying garrisons for another 15 months. The English commander, Lord Kitchener, ordered the countryside cleared of people and farm animals. Herds of cattle and sheep were rounded up, and women and children were forced into refugee camps. Thousands of internees died of disease. Facing the inevitable, the Boers finally surrendered when the British offered generous peace terms. Though small by later standards, the Boer War was the largest British military venture up to that point. Over 500,000 British troops fought over a 3-year period. Once again, British military power added new territory to the colonial empire. The war caused sharp political controversy and reaction against imperialism in Britain. It also marked the first time Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand units fought overseas in an imperial war. In Boer territory, the war resulted in deep-seated bitterness. Nevertheless, it made possible the early unification of southern Africa. In 1910, the defeated Boer states were incorporated into the Union of South Africa. The Boer conflict was one of the first wars of the century, but it would not be the last. Unfortunately, it would prove to be only a training ground for the horrors that lay ahead on the battlefields of World War I. On June 16, 1903, something happened that few people noticed, but that would forever change the way we live. It was on this day that Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company. With little fanfare, Ford set out to produce a car admired for its exceedingly reasonable price. Although his first cars didn't quite meet that goal, Ford's revolutionary techniques would soon make the horse-drawn carriage a thing of the past, and the effects would ripple through every aspect of society. At the turn of the century, cars were becoming more commonplace, but they were still primarily a luxury for the wealthy. Since the cars were made by hand from individually fitted parts, the cost of making the vehicles was prohibitively expensive for most people. A large majority still relied on horse-drawn carriages for transportation. In the past, specially trained technicians built a car from start to finish. They knew how each part operated and how to assemble the whole car. Ford changed the system so that the car would come to the worker. Each worker would have one simple task, which allowed Ford to hire unskilled workers. As the cars rolled by the workers, the parts would arrive on a conveyor belt. Workers would then quickly add their part to the car in progress and wait for the next car and part to roll down the line. The impact of the new construction process was almost unbelievable at the time. The Model T, which had originally gone on sale for over $800, eventually dropped in price to $290. At the same time, profits were so high that Ford raised the minimum wage in his plants to $5 a day. Not much by today's standards, but unheard of in Ford's day. Ford eagerly promoted his new production techniques, and as more companies began to adopt the methods, productivity and standards of living began to rise all around the world. And as cars began to give people more independence, their whole way of life began to change. Suburbs began to grow up around cities, and families began to spread out across the country. But more important, mass production has become the standard around the world, and industrialized nations now enjoy a higher standard of living than at any other time in history, all because one man wanted to find a better, less expensive way to make a car. December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers soared into history when they made their first powered airplane flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The Wrights discovered that Kitty Hawk was one of the breeziest places in the country, so they moved there in 1900 to test their man-carrying glider. After a year of successfully flying gliders, they began experiments with miniature planes in a bicycle-powered 6-foot wind tunnel. They learned enough about aerodynamics to design an engine-powered plane that would make the world's first successful powered flight. That airplane was named the Flyer, and it had a lightweight 25-horsepower engine. The Wright brothers made 4 flights that historic day. Orville made the first one, which flew 120 feet and lasted 12 seconds. Wilbur made the last flight. It went an incredible 852 feet and flew for 59 seconds. In their experiments, the Wrights came up with a basic control scheme used in airplanes to this day. They discovered that the plane's tail was a balancing device needed to help position the wings square to the wind. The Wright brothers made improvements in their subsequent planes and continued to have success, flying higher, faster, and longer with each new airplane. The world truly saw the future on December 17, 1903, when Orville and Wilbur Wright taught man how to fly. On February 8, 1904, Japanese torpedo boats attacked the Russian fleet in Port Arthur Harbor in China. Japanese warships bombarded the shore batteries and began a blockade of the port. 2 days later, formal war was declared, marking the beginning of a surprising David and Goliath conflict. As the new century had begun, the small island country of Japan was concerned about the spread of Russian influence in Manchuria and Korea. When the Russians acquired a lease at nearby Port Arthur in China and established a naval base there, Japan decided to act. Up to that point, all Russian harbors in the Far East were icebound for much of the year, leaving its Pacific fleet virtually useless. A base at Port Arthur would have given Russia its only year-round, ice-free Pacific harbor. The Russian fleet would then have been able to project strength in the Pacific and present a substantial threat to Japan. In the struggle that followed the Japanese attack, Russia suffered from grave disadvantages. Its military establishment in Eastern Asia was not large, and reinforcements and supplies had to pass over the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which stretched 5,500 miles from Moscow. Japan, on the other hand, was well supplied and had only a short sea passage from its home bases to the fighting zones. 3 months after the conflict began, the Russian army was driven out of Korea and into Manchuria, where most of the land actions of the war were fought. The Japanese pushed northward, and in March 1905 broke Russian resistance. During the 19-day Battle of Mukden, Russia lost more than 200,000 men. The main Russian naval strength was the Baltic Sea Fleet, halfway around the world from the conflict. The fleet left its home port in October 1904 for a 10,000-mile voyage to East Asia. After a 7-month trip around the Cape of Good Hope, the Russian fleet neared Japan on its way to the naval base in Siberia. On May 27, 1905, in the straits between Japan and Korea, the Russians were intercepted by the Japanese fleet. In the battle that followed, Japanese leadership, discipline, and gunnery proved far superior. When the action ended the next day, only 6 of the 30 Russian ships escaped. The rest had been sunk or captured, leaving Russia with virtually no navy. After more than a year of fighting, both Russia and Japan had suffered severe hardships. Russia faced a brewing revolution at home, and Japan was financially exhausted. Both sides wanted peace. Peace talks, arranged by President Theodore Roosevelt, led to a treaty signed at Portsmouth, New Hampshire on September 6, 1905. Russia yielded Port Arthur and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. They also agreed to withdraw from Manchuria and recognize Japan's dominant influence in Korea. The unexpected Japanese victory over the Russian giant shocked the world and won Japan recognition as a major power. It dealt a crippling blow to Russian military plans in Korea and Manchuria and virtually eliminated Russian naval power in the Far East. The worst damage was to the prestige of Tsar Nicholas II, who was the first leader of a modern European country to lose a war to an Asian power. Russia's disaster in the Far East revealed its military shortcomings to the world. Germany now began to think that they could also defeat Russia in battle. In 10 years, they would put the theory to a test in World War I. September 26, 1905. Albert Einstein's famous special theory of relativity was published in the German scientific journal Annalen der Physik. The theory's earth-shaking ramifications are still being felt today. Physicists had known for some time that their understanding of the laws of physics was incomplete. But when Einstein's theory was first published, it was an absolute revolution in thought. In fact, it was for a while a controversial topic among physicists, many of whom refused to believe in the outrageous predictions of his theory. The predictions of Einstein's theories are astounding even today. They state that time and space are not completely separate, but are instead closely interrelated. This led to the realization that mass and gravity bend space and time, so that two people can actually experience time differently. For example, imagine an astronaut could travel through space at near the speed of light. For the astronaut, as for everyone back on Earth, time will seem to pass normally. But if the astronaut returns after 2 years, time on Earth may have advanced as much as 200 years. But perhaps the most famous aspect of Einstein's theory is the seemingly simple formula E equals mc squared, which states that energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. Einstein had unlocked the power of the atom, and his predictions would be proved true when the first atomic bomb exploded in the New Mexico desert in 1945. After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein lamented that the world was not yet ready for atomic energy. Einstein was known as much for his charm and wit as for his brilliant thinking. And when asked for a simple explanation of relativity, he once said, "When a man sits with a pretty girl for an hour, it seems to him a minute. But let him sit on a hot stove for only a minute, and it seems longer than an hour. That's relativity." Einstein's theory of relativity caused major revolutions in physics and astronomy and changed the way we view our world. He was not only one of the most brilliant scientists of our century, he was one of the greatest thinkers of all time. April 18th, 1906. Day had not yet dawned over San Francisco when a rumble was heard from deep within the earth, and one of the most destructive earthquakes in American history tore through the city. At an estimated magnitude of 8.3, the first of 6 seismic waves struck at 5:13 in the morning, sending terrified citizens rushing into the streets. As awful as the earthquakes had been, the fires that followed were cataclysmic. The quake ruptured gas lines throughout the city, and fires broke out in more than 50 locations. The business section went up in flames, and fire swept rapidly toward Chinatown and the stately mansions on Russian Hill. Firemen rushed from their own damaged homes to help put out the flames, only to discover that the pumps were dry. The earthquake had also destroyed the water mains, and a burning city was left with virtually no water. With no equipment on hand to pump water from the ocean, the fire department was nearly helpless to fight the raging firestorm. For 3 days and 2 nights, the largest urban fire in recorded history stormed out of control. During that time, it consumed an area of 4 square miles, including almost the entire central business and industrial districts of San Francisco. Finally, on the 4th day, the fires were brought under control, and citizens were faced with a horrible reality. A city of 450,000 people had no food, no water, and half its population was homeless. Amazingly, only 500 had been killed, though thousands were injured. Hospitals had been destroyed. Looters roamed the streets. The city lay in ruins with the equivalent of $7 billion in damages. Army units from a nearby garrison were quickly called in to help restore order and were told to shoot looters on sight. Food kitchens were set up in rubble-filled streets to feed the hungry. Thousands fled. The nearby communities of Oakland and Berkeley had escaped the level of destruction that had engulfed San Francisco. 50,000 newly homeless refugees were packed on ferry boats and given shelter across the bay. The ferry's return trips were used to bring back water, which was then distributed by horse and wagon. 9 days after the earthquake, the city was functioning again. But by then, the shocking extent of the disaster was apparent. Especially hard hit were the opulent homes of the wealthy, who lived on Russian Hill and Nob Hill. The entire area was reduced to rubble. Work crews hunted through the ruins for weeks, looking for bodies of the missing. Walls that had not completely crumbled were ordered torn down to prevent further loss of life from falling rubble. It also became clear that the long unheeded claims of political corruption were true. Graft, kickbacks, and bribes were rampant during Mayor Schmidt's 3 terms in office. The newly completed and overpriced City Hall bore mute testimony to the charges. Built in a classical style with a splendid dome supported on 3 tiers of pillars, City Hall had collapsed like a movie set. Upon inspection, the pillars were discovered to be hollow. The earthquake had exposed the flimsy skeleton of a building that was supposed to be solid stone. The disaster that struck that April morning produced several unexpected benefits. The corruption that was uncovered as a result of the quake led to a political house cleaning. Mayor Schmitz was thrown out of office and brought to trial. Other crooked contractors and civic officials soon followed the mayor to jail. The wholesale destruction of thousands of shoddy buildings brought the need for strong building codes into clear focus for the first time. Future structures would be built much safer than they had ever been before that fateful morning. The city rebounded with amazing speed. Aid poured in from around the world, and reconstruction began within weeks. Rising from the ashes, San Francisco was totally rebuilt within 3 years. Today, it's considered one of the most beautiful cities in the world. On May 6, 1910, the world lost one of the last deterrents to war. Edward the Peacemaker was dead. Edward VII, King of the British Empire, Emperor of India, and one of the most popular leaders of his time, had died suddenly of pneumonia. Edward ascended the throne at a time when tensions were high in Europe due to entangling alliances and imperial rivalries. Edward's mother, Queen Victoria, had given birth to 8 other children, who all married into other royal families. This gave Edward relatives throughout the courts of Europe. Edward was everybody's favorite uncle. His diplomacy, strength, and personal magnetism helped to calm the waters and strengthen bonds in the dysfunctional family of European royalty. As the darkening clouds of World War I appeared on the horizon, Edward's diplomatic gifts proved invaluable. In the 9 short years of his reign, England's isolation had given way to a series of political attachments with 2 old enemies, France and Russia, and one promising new power, Japan. The resulting power shifts reverberated around the world and affected every country's relations with every other. England's new friendships caused particular concern to Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm felt that Edward, his mother's brother, threatened Germany's alliances and its dream of European domination. But on May 6th, when the announcement of King Edward's death was made, the Kaiser secretly rejoiced. Wilhelm joined his English relatives and royal representatives from 70 countries in saying farewell to his nemesis. With Edward's death, his nephew was free to consider himself the supreme power in Europe. Edward VII's death brought an end to a tranquil time of peace and prosperity. He may have been the only man in Europe with the power and influence to help prevent war. Without Edward's calming presence, however, the royal mixture of blue blood and politics would soon turn to red as war engulfed the continent. On October 10, 1911, an uprising in the Chinese city of Wuchang quickly escalated into a widespread revolt against the ruling Manchu dynasty all across China. Within months, nationalist leader Sun Yat-sen, who had organized earlier unsuccessful uprisings against the imperial dynasty's rule, would now take office as the elected provisional president of the new Republic of China. These historic events mark the birth of a new era for China. For the first time in recorded history, the country was not ruled by an emperor. Sun Yat-sen, the visionary leader who helped bring about these dramatic changes, was born in 1866 into a peasant family in southern China. As a young man, he briefly practiced medicine in Hong Kong. But Sun's real interests lay elsewhere. He soon embarked on what would become the defining mission of his life: to free China from the grip of the corrupt and incompetent ruling Manchu dynasty, headed by the Empress Dowager Cixi. Sun's dream was to establish a modern democratic state free from foreign imperialism and control. After Sun participated in a failed revolt against the Manchu dynasty in 1895, he went into exile. For the next 16 years, Sun traveled the globe, speaking eloquently about the need for radical democratic reforms in China. In 1905, Sun articulated the core ideas at the heart of his vision for a new China, which he called the 3 principles of the people. The 3 principles were nationalism, democracy, and the livelihood of the people. But Sun's repeated attempts to incite rebellion in China met with failure, until the revolt at Wuchang erupted on October 10, 1911, and quickly spread across the country. Sun returned to China, and on January 1, 1912, he took office as the provisional president of the Republic. But Sun was quickly forced to give up his position to the powerful northern warlord Yuan Shikai in order to avoid nationwide civil war. In 1913, when Yuan Shikai betrayed the Republic and moved to make himself emperor, Sun fled to Japan, where he reorganized the Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, under his personal control. Finally, in 1921, Sun established a republican government in Canton, though it controlled only a limited area in southern China. By 1924, Sun's government was receiving support from communist Russia in the form of money, military equipment, and training. In return for this Russian aid, Sun agreed to allow the Chinese Communist Party into his government. In 1925, while on a mission to achieve his dream of national unification, Sun Yat-sen died of cancer in Beijing. Sun's protege, Chiang Kai-shek, rose to power after Sun's death and began a decades-long battle with the communists, led by his arch-rival, Mao Zedong, to determine who would control China. By 1949, the communists had gained the advantage, and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army was on the brink of defeat. Chiang and his remaining forces left mainland China and escaped to the island of Taiwan, where they established a new government. On the mainland, the victorious communist regime, called the People's Republic of China, was officially proclaimed on October 1st, 1949. The pioneering work of Sun Yat-sen helped bring about tremendous change in China. Sun's courageous efforts to create a modern democratic state led to the historic end of the rule of the imperial dynasties. But Sun's decision to allow the communists into his government gave them a foothold in China that ultimately helped them take power. Today, Sun Yat-sen is revered in both China and Taiwan and remembered as the first great leader of modern China. December 14th, 1911. Roald Amundsen won a dramatic polar race when he became the first person to reach the South Pole. The race had begun 18 months earlier. Robert Peary's discovery of the North Pole had electrified the world in 1909. Amundsen now sailed from Norway, determined to conquer the South Pole. At about the same time, the British explorer Robert Scott sailed from England bound for the same destination. Both parties arrived in Antarctica in January of 1911. Before the Antarctic winter set in, both Amundsen and Scott deposited stores of food along the route that would later be taken to the pole. The deciding difference between the two teams proved to be the manner of transport. Amundsen relied on dog teams and sledges, while Scott used Siberian ponies. Amundsen started for the pole on October 20th, 1911, with 4 companions, 52 dogs, and 4 sledges, taking enough food for 4 months. The weather was favorable, and all went well. On December 14th, 1911, celestial observations confirmed that they had reached the South Pole. Meanwhile, Scott's 5-member team left their camp 11 days after Amundsen. Their Siberian ponies proved to be ill-suited for the snowy surface, forcing Scott and his men to drag their supplies on sledges. Exhausted, they reached the pole 35 days after Amundsen and were disheartened when they found the Norwegian flag flying. Weakened by shortages of food, the extremely low temperatures, and the effects of hauling their own supplies, Scott's return trip would end in disaster. First, a man died after a serious fall. A month later, a second member, who was badly frostbitten and aware that he was hampering his comrades, walked out into a driving snowstorm in a supreme act of self-sacrifice. Finally, within miles of a well-stocked depot, they were forced to stop and pitch a tent during a massive blizzard. 6 months later, the bodies of Scott and his men were found in a snowed-up tent on the Antarctic ice. Scott's last diary entry is haunting. We are getting weaker, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write anymore. The courage and sacrifice of both teams opened a new chapter in man's discovery and understanding of the world. Unfortunately, the most dramatic story in Antarctic polar exploration ended in tragedy, as well as triumph. April 14th, 1912. Shortly before midnight, off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, the largest and most sumptuously appointed vessel that had ever put to sea steamed towards disaster. On its maiden voyage, the SS Titanic collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic, sending more than 1,500 to an icy death. The liner had sailed from Southampton, England, only 4 days earlier, bound for New York City. Its vast ballrooms and sprawling upper decks cradled the cream of English and American high society. At a time when an average yearly salary was less than $1,000, first-class passengers paid well over $4,000 for the trip. Despite urgent warning of dangerous conditions that night, the ship's captain arrogantly maintained the Titanic's speed as it plowed headlong into an ice field. Most of the passengers were apparently unaware of the accident when it happened. When the giant 46,000-ton ship brushed an iceberg for a mere 10 seconds, it was barely enough of a touch to spill a glass of champagne. But when Thomas Andrews, the engineer who had overseen the building of the Titanic, rushed starboard, he found a 300-foot gash along the hull, open to the sea. Although the ship had been outfitted with every luxury imaginable, lifeboats had not been considered important. The ship was thought to be unsinkable, and there were no lifeboats available for half the people on board. The liner remained afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes after the impact. Although there was a ship passing nearby, it made no attempt to rescue the sinking vessel. Its radio operator had gone off duty for the night, and the Titanic's desperate calls for help went unheard. Of the 2,222 passengers and crew on the Titanic, only 705 survived, mostly women and children. As a result of the disaster, international maritime safety rules were changed. 24-hour radio monitoring became mandatory, and adequate lifeboat space is now required for passengers and crews of all ships. Almost 75 years later, an international team of oceanographers located the Titanic resting in several pieces 2 miles down on the ocean floor. Items retrieved from the expedition went on display as a tribute to the 1,500 lives lost, and as a grim reminder of the worst shipwreck in world history. October 10th, 1913. One of the greatest engineering feats in history was officially completed with the opening of the Panama Canal. The waters of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were joined when President Woodrow Wilson pushed a button in Washington, exploding dynamite that destroyed the final barrier between the two bodies of water. The achievement fulfilled a centuries-old dream of reducing the 7,000-mile-long voyage around Cape Horn. After the explorer Balboa crossed the width of Panama in 1513 and discovered that only a 50-mile-wide strip of land separated the Atlantic from the Pacific, the possibility of constructing a canal that would connect the oceans seemed feasible. Through the years, such varied and distinguished people as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Simon Bolivar had been advocates of a canal. A Frenchman, Ferdinand de Lesseps, was the first to undertake construction of a canal. He had directed the building of the Suez Canal and was the premier canal builder of his time. At the time, Panama was a province of Colombia. De Lesseps organized a private company and obtained digging rights in Panama from the government of Colombia. He began construction in February of 1881. The prohibitive costs of cutting through the hard rock of the Continental Divide had not been foreseen by the engineer, who had built a canal through the sand dunes of Suez. Other problems contributed to his ultimate failure, particularly epidemics of malaria and yellow fever that had struck down a large part of the European labor force. The company went bankrupt in 1889, and construction on the canal was abandoned. Through the years, various attempts were made to salvage the ambitious plan. Problems moving the Navy between oceans during the Spanish-American War of 1898 convinced the United States of the strategic military importance of a canal across the isthmus. One of the major forces behind the project was President Teddy Roosevelt, who formed the commission to study alternate Central American routes. It was finally agreed to follow the basic path of the unfinished French Canal. With Roosevelt's encouragement, there was a revolt in the province of Panama in 1904, which resulted in its independence from Colombia. Shortly thereafter, a treaty was signed with the new country of Panama, which allowed the U.S. to build the Panama Canal. Using a labor force that at times reached 40,000 men, construction began later that year. The equivalent of $660 million was paid to the French company for its initial work. $165 million was paid to Panama for construction rights, with an additional amount to be paid to the country every year thereafter. The treaty granted to the United States in perpetuity complete jurisdiction over a strip of land 10 miles wide across the isthmus, which became known as the Canal Zone. The U.S. government soon faced the same obstacles that had stymied the French. The engineering plan was eventually changed to a lock design that precluded cutting through large stretches of rock. The canal could not have been completed, however, without the work of medical science. After it was discovered that malaria and yellow fever were carried by mosquitoes, both diseases were virtually eradicated from the canal zone. Even so, more than 6,000 workers died during the 10 years it took to build the canal. Decades of brewing dissatisfaction over the terms of the treaty came to a head in 1964, when Panamanian rioters clashed with U.S. troops. It was to take 15 more years of painful and painstaking negotiations to arrive at a new agreement. In 1979, a new treaty became effective that gave sovereignty of the canal to the country of Panama. More than 80 years after it was completed, the Panama Canal is still one of the greatest engineering achievements in the world. June 28, 1914. Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife Sophie were assassinated by a Serbian nationalist while visiting the Bosnian town of Sarajevo near the border of Serbia. This event was the spark that would ignite World War I and cause millions to meet untimely deaths. At first, no one could imagine that Europe would soon be destroying its wealth and manhood over this incident. But the unthinkable did happen due to imperial rivalries, entangling alliances, and mutual mistrust. Austria, awaiting a pretext for suppressing Slavic nationalism, declared war on Serbia. Germany did not want war, but their alliance with Austria made them an unwilling accomplice. When Kaiser Wilhelm II heard that Russia was mobilizing its army to help defend their fellow Slavs in Serbia, he telegraphed his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, and told him to delay the order and help prevent a great powers' war in Europe. The Tsar considered doing this, but was told by his ministers that the momentum of a great army in mobilization is like a great machine at full speed, and that it could not be stopped without incalculable damage. Nearly 1.5 million Russians began to march west. The news of Russia's full mobilization fixed Europe's fate. The Kaiser gave the order to mobilize the German army, and 500,000 men marched east to fight. The Germans demanded that the French stay neutral. The leaders of the French army railed against this challenge, not only because of their rather vague alliance with the Russians, but because they wanted to avenge their humiliating loss to the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Cooler heads in the French government appealed to England and asked them to declare their support for France. The French believed that if the British made an immediate declaration to the Germans that England was aligned with France, there would not be a war. Unfortunately, the British vacillated, and another opportunity to avert war was lost. On August 1st, the French began mobilization. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, and over 1.5 million men marched toward a collision course on the French border. The fastest and easiest way for the German invasion force to reach France was to march through the small, neutral country of Belgium. Germany demanded free passage, but Belgium defied mighty Germany and warned that any violation of its borders would be resisted. The resulting slaughter of the Belgian army and the massacre of innocent civilians would forever turn the tide of world sympathy away from Imperial Germany. The British may have been indifferent to the Austrian-Russian battle for dominance in the Balkans, but they did not want to see Germany, undoubtedly the strongest power on the continent, moving through Belgium into France. On August 4th, the British gave Germany an ultimatum. Halt your advance through Belgium, or we will be at war by midnight. They were at war the next day. Within a short time, all of the major powers in the world would be engaged in the bloodiest war the world had yet seen. By the end of the war, over 10 million people, a whole generation, would be wiped out, and Europe would be in ruins. And incredible as it may seem, it all began when the Archduke and his wife were gunned down in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. January 25th, 1915. Alexander Graham Bell speaks into a mouthpiece in New York, and his voice travels across the nation to San Francisco, where Thomas Watson, his longtime collaborator, hears him. For this first transcontinental phone call, Bell repeats the words he spoke to Watson almost 40 years earlier, when together they built an ingenious device that revolutionized human communication, the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, an immigrant from Scotland whose mother and wife were both deaf, had a lifelong fascination with the human voice. He journeyed to Boston, and in 1872, at the age of 25, he founded a school for deaf children and began creating devices to help people hear. His experiment with an apparatus called the harmonic telegraph convinced him that an electrical wire connecting a transmitter to a receiver could carry different vibrations of sound, even sound as unique in tone and range as the human voice. To craft precision parts for his idea, Bell hired Thomas Watson, an electrical machinist by trade. Bell's eccentric ideas fired up Watson. Watson's engineering expertise inspired Bell. Years later, Thomas Watson recalls this creative partnership.
The telephone. I remember my surprise when he first told me that he expected soon to be able to talk by telegraph, explaining to me his conception of an electric current that would copy the vibrations of speech.
On March 10th, 1876, Watson delivered a transmitter to Bell powered by a battery. This early film dramatizes what happened next. On the top floor of number 5 Exeter Place, Watson hurried down the hall to the room where he'd set up his receiver. There, he listened.
But as Bell was about to speak into the new instrument, a motion of his arm upset over his clothes a battery jar of acidulated water. In the excitement of the accident, Bell called out to me, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." The big mouthpiece picked up his call for help, and I heard every word of it through the receiver at my ear. The new transmitter was better than we had expected or had dared hope.
A few months after this accident, Bell and Watson produced a telephone to demonstrate at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Away from the crowds, Bell spoke into his transmitter. On the exhibition floor, Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil, exclaimed, "My God, it talks!" Bell and Watson, unknown inventors from Boston, dazzled the public with their invention. By October, they were able to conduct the first two-way conversation. Watson in a factory in Cambridgeport, and Bell 2 miles away in Boston. The first switchboard was installed in New Haven the following year. Soon after, lightweight copper wire replaced iron, making suspended phone lines possible. The rapidly expanding Bell Telephone Company turned west, connecting with Chicago by 1892. Phone lines stretched further. The goal, a transcontinental service. But in Denver, engineers met with an obstacle. The signal from New York grew weak, and voices became barely audible. Thicker wires were used, but the problem persisted. Then, in 1906, an amplifier was invented, eventually boosting signals loud enough to reach the far west. By 1915, the long-anticipated transcontinental link had been made. Bell, in New York, telephoned Watson in San Francisco.
And even when he spoke into a reproduction of his first telephone, his voice brought clearly to me the words of that now historic first sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you."
In the years to come, the telephone, along with the telegraph, transformed the battlefields of World War I, tying command posts to trenches instantly. By the 1920s, the telephone had become a common piece of household furniture, and phone lines crisscrossed the nation, launching an era of global communication Bell and Watson could only dream of. On the evening of April 24, 1915, in the city of Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, hundreds of Armenian community leaders were rounded up and later executed by the Turkish government. The ruthless killing of these men was an early harbinger of the wholesale slaughter of the Armenian people, the first genocide or organized mass murder of an ethnic group in the 20th century. Between 1915 and 1918, it is estimated that 1 million Armenians were killed as part of the barbaric campaign of extermination directed by Turkish authorities. By 1923, after further massacres, hundreds of thousands more Armenians had been killed. The roots of this Holocaust can be traced in part to ethnic and religious tensions arising from the ongoing collapse of the once powerful Ottoman Empire, which had been disintegrating for hundreds of years. In the late 19th century, the empire was ruled by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, also known as the Red Sultan because of his bloody methods. Concerned that Armenian aspirations for more civil rights would grow into an independence movement, the Sultan encouraged a series of massacres that killed between 200,000 and 500,000 Armenians between 1894 and 1896. Dissatisfaction mounted with the Sultan's autocratic and corrupt leadership, and in 1908, the Sultan was overthrown during the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turk leaders initially promised equal rights for all minorities in the empire. But in 1913, an ultranationalist group within the movement seized power. It was comprised of men who believed in creating a pure Turkish state that excluded non-Muslim, non-Turkish minorities like the Armenians. 3 of these men led the regime and would later be responsible for initiating the Armenian genocide. They were Enver Pasha, Minister of War, Talat Pasha, Minister of Internal Affairs, and Cemal Pasha, Minister of the Navy. These leaders forged closer ties with Germany, which supplied the Turks with military assistance and training. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire aligned itself with Germany and the Central Powers in World War I, and another justification for liquidating the Armenian population presented itself. The Muslim Turks, who were fighting the Christian Russians in the war, feared that their own Christian Armenian subjects would rise up and fight on the side of the enemy. So the Young Turk leadership conceived and set in motion a savage plan to eliminate the Armenian population. Early in 1915, the Turkish government began disarming all Armenians serving in the military, turning many of them into road laborers and pack animals. These men were then worked to death or shot. Sometimes they were made to dig their own graves before being murdered. On the evening of April 24, 1915, the Turkish government launched the next stage of the genocide by eliminating the Armenian cultural and political elite in Istanbul, the very men who would have been most likely to have organized the resistance against the genocide. In the months that followed, the Turkish government ordered the deportation of all Armenians from the empire. Under the cover of these so-called deportations, thousands of mostly women, children, and elderly Armenians were forced to leave their homes and travel hundreds of miles on foot. Though many of these Armenian refugees perished from disease and lack of food and water, others were viciously killed by butcher battalions. These bands, part of a secret government-formed group called the Special Organization, were made up of criminals and murderers, and were employed to massacre the exhausted and defenseless refugees. The Special Organization's methods were savage and barbaric. They raped, stole, and often used swords to hack their victims to death. Younger Armenian women were sometimes kidnapped and sold into bondage in Muslim and Turkish homes. Countless other Armenians were hanged, shot, even burned to death during the Turks' murderous rampage. Armenian babies were thrown against walls, and older children were poisoned to death. Even their churches were reduced to rubble. The relatively small number of Armenians who survived the death marches and reached northern Syria were rounded up in squalid camps and then dispatched into the desert to die. The American ambassador to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau, was horrified by the atrocities going on around him. Morgenthau helped publicize the genocide in America, which led to the formation of the Near East Relief Committee. Near East Relief raised funds and set up medical and educational facilities for the survivors of the Holocaust, eventually saving tens of thousands of Armenian lives. After World War I ended in defeat for Turkey, a new government took power and conducted trials which sentenced the former Turkish leaders to death for their atrocities. But they had long since fled the country. The principal mastermind behind the Armenian slaughter, Talat Pasha, was eventually assassinated in Berlin in 1921 by Armenian activists. Tragically, the short pause in the slaughter of Armenians ended when a new nationalist Turkish movement, led by Kemal Ataturk, started a series of military campaigns between 1920 and 1923 that resulted in the decimation of the remaining Armenians in the region. The new Turkish Republic, founded in 1923, began an official policy of denying the genocide ever took place, a denial which the current Turkish government continues to this day. In the years following the mass killing of the Armenians, the world seemed to forget about the genocide. This amnesia would soon embolden another dictator, Adolf Hitler. In justifying his own murderous rampage, Hitler once said, "Who still speaks of the extermination of the Armenians?" Tens of thousands of Armenians escaped the genocide and settled in countries all over the world where their descendants still live today. Many others fled to Russian Armenia, an area which would become a part of the Soviet Union. Since voting to declare their independence from the former Soviet Union on September 21, 1991, Armenians have once again had their own country. Armenians the world over now annually commemorate April 24th as a day to remember the victims of the century's first genocide. Despite the condemnation of millions of people in many nations around the world, Turkey still has not acknowledged its dark past. July 1st, 1916. At 7:28 a.m., nearly 400,000 British and French troops climbed up from their trenches and headed across no man's land. Their goal, to attack the German army entrenched along the Somme River in France. This marked the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, a monstrous struggle that would last months and shake the world with its bloody carnage and, in the end, its utter futility. The Allied High Command convinced their respective governments that the best way to end the stalemate on the Western Front and win the war was to mount a great offensive. They would attack the center of one of the best fortified German positions on the front. It was a foolhardy decision that would end in catastrophe. The incredibly destructive and accurate firepower of new weapons like the machine gun and the long-range cannon made the massed infantry bayonet charges of earlier wars obsolete. Unfortunately, this fact had still not been learned by the Allied High Command. Within the first 15 minutes of the attack, thousands of advancing troops were cut to shreds by the deadly German machine gun fire. By the end of the first day, British casualties alone reached 60,000. Over 19,000 lay dead or mortally wounded. The fighting raged on for months. On September 15th, the British launched a general attack on a 10-mile front and used tanks on the battlefield for the first time. Although there were too few tanks to make much of a difference, their potential was noted. Back in Britain, with the true picture of the battle emerging, there was much public protest about the way the war was being fought. There was also a growing anti-war movement. On a political level, one direct result of the disastrous Somme campaign was a change in the leadership of the coalition government. David Lloyd George was appointed the new prime minister, and a new cabinet was announced, including the presence of a young Winston Churchill. Back on the battlefield, the Allies had conquered about 125 square miles of territory, but nothing of great strategic importance. On November 18th, the Battle of the Somme ended, with British losses at a staggering 400,000 men. The French lost almost 200,000. Though German casualties were nearly as high, it did not lessen the pain and sense of loss felt in England and France. When the Allies set out on July 1st, 1916, they had intended to win the Battle of the Somme and the war. But the battle only showed how difficult this was going to be. The bloody destruction and horror of World War I continued for another 2 years. March 16, 1917. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty. The Tsar signed the document of relinquishment after months of turmoil and in the midst of a volatile political situation that would soon lead to all-out revolution. As power passed to a provincial government led by Alexander Kerensky, the Tsar himself went to bid a final farewell to his army. Years of misgovernment and a rigid inflexibility led to his demise. Failures on the battlefield during World War I made the war less and less popular with the masses. 2 million men had died in 1915 alone, and by 1917, some 9 million troops were either killed, missing, or had died of cold and hunger. And it wasn't only the soldiers who were suffering. The winter of 1917 was extremely cold, and starvation was gripping large areas of the country. What little food there was prevented from reaching the people by bureaucratic incompetence. Workers went on strike, and people took to the streets demanding an end to the war. Troops sent in to deal with the demonstrators refused to obey orders. Just as public support for the war reached its lowest ebb, Nicholas took personal command of the army. It was a fatal mistake. Just when he should have been distancing himself from the disastrous consequences of the war, it appeared to the people that he was approving the conduct of the war. Soon the whole country was in revolt. On November 7th, a coup d'etat led by Vladimir Lenin toppled the provisional government. The Bolsheviks were now in power, and Nicholas II and his family were exiled to Siberia. Within months, Russia would erupt into civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the pro-monarchy White Army. Alive, Nicholas was the most serious threat to the legitimacy of the new Bolshevik regime. On July 16, 1918, Nicholas and his family were executed. There was no turning back now. Russia was about to begin 70 years of communist rule. April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and entered World War I. President Woodrow Wilson asked for the declaration of war, proclaiming that the world must be made safe for democracy. Only the year before, American public opinion about entering the war was still divided, and Wilson was reelected largely on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Wilson had always felt that the U.S. could be the mediator. but his attempts at negotiating a peace had proved unsuccessful. On January 31st, 1917, the United States was informed by Germany that unrestricted submarine warfare would begin on February 1st. Germany said it would sink every vessel that approached Great Britain, Ireland, and some Mediterranean ports. In response, Wilson severed relations with the German government and stated that the new German policy represented a war against all nations. During February and March, several American ships were sunk. British intelligence also intercepted a secret telegram known as the Zimmermann Note that revealed a German offer to Mexico to join in an attack of the U.S. The president now had specific and compelling reasons to declare war on Germany. Wilson would not tolerate full submarine warfare against commercial vessels of neutral nations, especially in light of what had happened to the British passenger ship, the Lusitania. On May 7, 1915 at 2:15 p.m., the Lusitania was struck on the starboard side by a torpedo fired from a German U-boat. A huge explosion ensued. The engine stopped and the crew tried to lower the lifeboats. But minutes later, a second torpedo hit the engine room. This was the fatal blow. Some survivors donned life belts and jumped into the ocean. Others crowded into the remaining lifeboats. Within 18 minutes, the Lusitania had sunk into the ocean's depths. Of a total of 1,906 passengers and crew, 1,198 innocent people were lost, including 128 Americans. This animation was created and shown to the public in movie theaters in order to gain support for entering the war. A wave of resentment against Germany swept over the United States, which influenced its later entry into the war. The German government expressed no regret over the incident and asserted that American citizens had been warned in U.S. newspapers not to sail to Great Britain. They also claimed that the ship was secretly carrying arms and munitions to England. This was vehemently denied by the British. Ironically, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, though very effective, may have ultimately cost them the war. Their continued assault on unarmed American commercial ships brought the U.S. into a war that it had desperately tried to avoid. Soon, the nearly unlimited might of the largest industrial power in the world and millions of determined young American men would tip the scales against Germany and the Central Powers. On April 6, 1917, the U.S. did more than declare war. It declared that it was now a global power with the will and the strength to assert its convictions anywhere in the world. November 11, 1918. At 11 a.m., fighting ceased on the Western Front, and the whole world breathed a sigh of relief. The nightmare of World War I was finally over. The Germans signed an armistice at 5 a.m., and the ceasefire took effect 6 hours later. In cities all over the globe, ecstatic people celebrated the end of the bloody 5-year war. At a peace conference in Paris on June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed by 70 delegates representing 27 of the victorious countries. President Wilson succeeded in getting the delegates to create a League of Nations as part of the General Peace Treaty. Wilson was the first Allied leader to sign the treaty. Ironically, Wilson could not get the U.S. Senate to ratify the agreement. The U.S. would never join the League. The treaty imposed severe punishments on Germany, including enormous reparations to be paid, restrictions on its military, and the loss of considerable territory. Critics of the treaty warned it could cause serious resentment among the German people, which could lead to even bigger problems with Germany in the future. Nonetheless, the war was over and the Allies had won. The last shot of World War I was fired on November 11, 1918. Joyous citizens everywhere celebrated, and the world held new hope for lasting peace. Eventually, Armistice Day would evolve into the holiday Veterans Day. a time when Americans remember all of those who gave their lives in war. August 26, 1920, an historic step towards women's equality was achieved when women's suffrage became law. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, giving women the right to vote. The signing of this proclamation ended an 81-year struggle for American women. The quest for the right to vote began in America at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. After the Civil War, the movement gained momentum. In 1869, Wyoming was the first state to allow women to vote. At the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote in 1870, the suffragists were split into two camps, one opposed to the 15th Amendment because it did not include women, and one favoring it, hoping it would lead to women's suffrage. In 1890, the two groups united, forming the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Perseverance led to victory. The suffrage movement paralleled the fight for women's rights in other areas of life. Women were entering the job markets, often doing work only men used to do, and they were enjoying themselves in public while wearing shocking attire. Coming out of the repressive Victorian era, this was an important time for women's emancipation in the United States and around the world. In Great Britain, as in America, the suffragists struggled to combat traditional values and prejudices. Some women became extremely militant and practiced civil disobedience. They were frequently arrested. One woman sacrificed her life at the Epsom horse race in order to draw attention to her cause. Emily Davison became a martyr of the movement. She was honored with a huge funeral procession attended by the leaders of the suffrage movement. Women over the age of 30 could vote in Great Britain as of 1918. 10 years later, suffrage rights for men and women were equalized. While several European countries gave women the vote in the early 20th century, some waited until the 1940s. Switzerland finally extended the ballot to women in 1971. Today in the United States, more women than ever before hold political offices. There are women governors, senators, and women in the House of Representatives. Perhaps even one day, there will be a woman in the White House. And the road to political involvement all started back on August 26, 1920. November 2nd, 1920. At 8 o'clock in the evening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the first licensed commercial radio station in America, KDKA, began broadcasting using a 100-watt transmitter. Radio hobbyist Frank Conrad, an engineer at Westinghouse, stayed on the air past midnight, reporting incoming presidential election returns.
This is KDKA of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We shall now broadcast the election returns. We are receiving these returns through the cooperation and by special arrangements with the Pittsburgh Post and Sun.
Less than 1,000 radio receivers were listening to the broadcast. But when news of this historic event spread, public interest in radio surged. The rush to build radio stations and receivers that followed gave birth to an industry that would transform American society. The technology of radio itself was only a few decades old. Back in 1898, an Italian named Guglielmo Marconi had built the world's first commercial radio service. Marconi erected a wireless telegraph transmitter on an island off the Irish coast. The transmitter used Morse code to broadcast news of incoming vessels to the mainland. Then, in 1901, Marconi succeeded in sending and receiving a Morse code signal across the Atlantic Ocean. Another significant breakthrough occurred in 1906 on the coast of Massachusetts. Here, American Reginald Fessenden transmitted the world's first radio broadcast. Fessenden sent voice and music to surprised wireless operators on ships and shore within a 15-mile area. Impressive as these achievements were, commercial radio broadcasting would not develop into an industry for another 14 years, due in part to technical limitations and a lack of funding. One impediment to the growth of radio broadcasting was that basic technology patents were held by different companies. This issue was resolved in 1919 with the creation of the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, which pooled the fundamental radio patents of several large corporations. Also in 1919, radio hobbyist Frank Conrad began broadcasting out of his garage near Pittsburgh. When in 1920 a local department store ran a promotion to sell radio receivers and advertise Conrad's broadcasts, the receivers were quickly snapped up. Conrad's employer, Westinghouse, soon offered to build Conrad a transmitter and station, and the first licensed commercial radio station, KDKA, was born. Soon, several more stations were up and running, from WJZ in Newark to KYW in Chicago. An early visionary in radio broadcasting was David Sarnoff, who in 1916 proposed selling what he called radio music boxes. But his proposal was ignored. Sarnoff later became general manager of RCA Broadcasting and launched WJY in New York. On July 2, 1921, Sarnoff's WJY broadcast the Dempsey versus Carpentier boxing match to an estimated audience of hundreds of thousands of listeners. Network broadcasting, where one station would offer programming to other stations across the country, soon began, as did on-air commercials. Early radio stations were all licensed by the government to transmit on one frequency, 833.3 kilohertz. As a result, stations in the same region would sometimes try to overpower one another, using greater signal strength. Congress finally moved to end the chaos when it passed the Radio Act of 1927, which created a Federal Radio Commission to assign frequencies and regulate the industry. The Radio Act also stated that stations did not own the frequencies they broadcast on because the airwaves belonged ultimately to the people. Early radio programming was dominated by music and also included drama, comedy, and variety shows. Over the years, radio continued to grow at an amazing pace. In 1930, 12 million homes had radio receivers, but by the end of the decade, 30 million homes had radio receivers. During the 1930s, news became an important part of radio programming.
Hot off the wires of United Press. Washington. The United States Supreme Court today handed down its long-awaited decision on the...
Live broadcasts enabled millions of people to hear major events as they happened. Events such as the Lindbergh baby kidnapping trial.
Hello, everybody. We're speaking to you now from the General Store in Hopewell, New Jersey, the improvised press headquarters during the Lindbergh case. We have here a flash which reads as follows. If the kidnappers of our child are unwilling to deal directly, we fully authorize Salvi Spitali and Irving Bitts to act as our go-between.
And even much later, news of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The United States formally declared war on the Empire of Japan. Following yesterday's shattering and unprovoked attacks by the Japanese on Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and Midway, Congress met today at noon. By 4:15, the resolution declaring war was passed without debate and signed by the President, and the United States was at war.
Radio's golden age didn't last long. Starting in the late 1940s, television began to appear, and radio lost audience and advertisers to this new medium. But radio survived the onslaught of television, and in the decades that followed, it changed with the times and flourished. Since its inception, radio has proven to be a powerful and enduring communications medium, one that has had a profound and lasting impact on the history of the 20th century. On December 7, 1921, Southern Ireland became the Irish Free State, and a major step was taken towards ending centuries of domination under Great Britain. Ireland had been struggling under British rule for over 800 years. After World War I, Irish nationalism surged and caused internal conflicts between those wanting to remain in the British Commonwealth and those wanting independence. In 1920, Ireland was divided into two territories: the 26 counties in the mainly Catholic, anti-British Southern Ireland, and the 6 mostly Protestant counties in pro-British Northern Ireland. Each had its own parliament and administration. With the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, the new Irish Free State became self-governing within the British Commonwealth. British forces began moving out. The 6 northern counties were not included in the treaty, choosing to remain under British control rather than be ruled by a nationalist Roman Catholic government in Dublin. According to the terms of the treaty, officials of the new Irish Free State would still swear loyalty to the British Crown, and Britain would still be granted military base rights in Ireland during wartime. But on this historic day, the British troops were packing up and shipping out. The political wing promoting Irish nationalism, called Sinn Féin, which means ourselves alone, had won the day. The British attempts to smash Sinn Féin had finally ended. A new flag was raised over Dublin. At their Dublin barracks, the last British officer to leave acknowledged the salute by guards from the Irish Republican Army. IRA leader Michael Collins was a proponent of Sinn Féin and the new treaty, and the commander-in-chief of the new army. Army recruits, including soldiers who'd fought the British in the past, enthusiastically signed up to serve under Collins. Ironically, the first uniforms for this new Irish army were made from British khaki dyed green. But that didn't dampen the spirits of the new volunteer soldiers. While the signing of the treaty brought an end to centuries of conflict between Ireland and England, it also provoked political division within Ireland. There were still those who wanted a united Ireland, such as Mrs. McSweeney, who went on a hunger strike at Mountjoy Jail in Dublin. And then there was the anti-treaty faction, who called for complete separation from the British. Their opposition would lead to an Irish Civil War from 1922 to 1923, which would be won by the pro-treaty forces. On August 22, 1922, Michael Collins, age 31, was killed in an ambush. He had been the target of several attacks, and it is speculated his killing was in reprisal for the recent killing of a treaty opponent. He is remembered as the leader who was instrumental in the creation of the Irish Free State. The Irish Free State finally gained complete self-rule in 1949, when Britain recognized the independence of the Republic of Ireland. While conflicts in Northern Ireland continue to this day, Ireland was propelled on its journey toward independence by the Irish Free State Treaty, signed on December 7, 1921. October 30th, 1922, a day that changed the fate of Italy and the world when Mussolini's fascists marched on Rome. 40,000 members of Benito Mussolini's militia advanced on the city carrying bayonets and wearing their symbolic black shirts. They were prepared to attack Rome if necessary. Knowing a conflict with the fascists was inevitable, King Victor Emmanuel forced Italy's current prime minister and cabinet to resign and welcomed Mussolini, inviting him to form a new government. The fascists met with little local resistance and were cheered enthusiastically. The Italians were weary after World War I and in desperate need of strong leadership. They also feared the communist menace. They embraced Mussolini as Il Duce, the leader. Mussolini immediately named a new cabinet with fascists in the majority and proceeded to take political control of Italy. He espoused the fascist doctrine that the state must be served by the people. The people were not guaranteed rights but duties. Mass mobilization and widespread control were necessary. During the early years of Mussolini's regime, Italy gained new respect from Europe's major powers. As industrialization was improved, Mussolini boasted that only he could make the trains run on time. But the cost for such improvements was high. Mussolini's government soon turned Italy into a police state. The opposition press was banned and its leaders banished. Mussolini began a systematic assault on the civil, economic, and political rights of Italians. Mussolini actively tried to set up fascist regimes throughout the Mediterranean. When his successful war against Ethiopia was criticized by the League of Nations, he allied with Nazi Germany. Mussolini waited until the fall of France before entering World War II in 1940. He followed Hitler's lead in declaring war on Russia in June 1941 and on the United States in December 1941. After Italy was defeated, the king dismissed and arrested Mussolini. In 1945, he was executed. But he left behind a never-to-be-forgotten legacy of fascism. September 1st, 1923, one of the largest earthquakes in recorded history leveled Tokyo, Yokohama, and every city within 100 miles. The massive earthquake was centered near Japan's most densely populated area, which was also the hub of the nation's business and government. The quake was later estimated to be a magnitude 7.8 shaker. As a result of the earthquake, over 100,000 people died, hundreds of thousands more were injured, and over 2 million people were left homeless. The starving survivors were left to fend for themselves by catching fish in ponds and lakes, or waiting in 2-mile-long lines for a daily ration of 1 ball of rice. An estimated 100,000 tons of rice alone were needed to feed them. Lack of clean water and food also led to an outbreak of cholera in Yokohama. Martial law was declared in Tokyo, where the quake took the lives of more than 60,000 people. Many were killed as a result of quake-caused fires that raged out of control. Billions of dollars of property loss were attributed to the tragedy. In its history, Japan has had to endure many large earthquakes. Of all the energy released in the world yearly by earthquakes, an estimated 10% is concentrated in and around Japan. But few natural disasters have had the devastating impact of the great earthquake of September 1st, 1923. January 21st, 1924, Vladimir Lenin was dead at the age of 54. Thousands of mourners braved freezing cold temperatures to pay their last respects to the man who was the founder of the Russian Communist Party, leader of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, and the first head of state of the USSR. Lenin's political career began with his devotion to revolutionary activities. In developing what would later be called Leninism, he studied the issues of revolutionary change in Russia from a Marxist perspective. In adapting Marx's views of a proletariat class revolution to Russia, Lenin advocated the importance of an elite party which would lead the uneducated workers. In 1903, Lenin organized the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and he ran the Bolshevik Party in this elitist fashion. Lenin became a masterful politician, and he played a key role in the failed 1905 uprising. In 1917, following Lenin's lead, the Bolsheviks refused to support Russia in its war efforts. Lenin denounced World War I as a fight among imperialist powers for control of the labor of the undeveloped world. He believed that Russia's defeat would actually be beneficial, since it would weaken the monarchy. Having spent years laying the foundation, Lenin returned from exile and successfully brought the Bolsheviks to power in 1917. When the monarchy was overthrown, Tsar Nicholas II was exiled and later executed by the Bolsheviks. On November 7th, the first Soviet government was formed with Lenin at its head. He consolidated Bolshevik power into the Russian Communist Party, established a secret police, and reformed the economy along Marxist principles. Lenin was confronted with civil war, famines, epidemics, and protests. When he realized the Russian Revolution would be endangered without greater support from the peasants, he introduced the new economic policy which gave peasants more control over their land and goods. On May 25, 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke and after a long illness died. He was succeeded by Joseph Stalin. The former capital city of St. Petersburg was renamed Leningrad in Lenin's honor. Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square became the most renowned shrine in the communist world. Leninism continued to be a significant component of communist thought, although in the 1980s, a new spirit of questioning Lenin's doctrines arose. As the Soviet Union began to crumble and communism gave way to new forms of government, statues of Lenin were torn down as well. The era was over. Even the name of Leningrad was changed back to St. Petersburg. January 27, 1926, Scottish inventor John Baird presented the first successful public demonstration of television, and the world would never be the same. Baird's television featured a spirally perforated rotating disc, which functioned as a mechanical scanner. Used with a photoelectric cell which converted light into electrical impulses, this device could break down an image into a sequence of tiny pictorial elements. The images were sent via a transmitter to a receiver, which reassembled the impulses into the picture, ready for viewing. During this time, inventors were also developing an electronic scanning system, which was the second type of method for sending television pictures. Both methods transmitted pictures only. Sound was sent by radio. Electronic scanning using the cathode ray picture tube proved to be the best method. In 1928, General Electric presented the first dramatic production on television, The Queen's Messenger. The sound portion of the show was simulcast over a radio station. 2 years later, GE broadcast a cartoon image of Felix the Cat instantaneously from New York to Sydney, Australia, and back. In 1932, NBC, a subsidiary of RCA, started broadcasting experimental telecasts from the Empire State Building. 2 years later, field tests were made of an all-electronic system which sent higher quality pictures. Television was seen as the wave of the future. The first regular television service started in 1939, when NBC broadcast the opening ceremonies of the New York World's Fair. The same year, the first television sets were sold to the public. The TV picture quality was getting better, as improvements were made in the production of the cathode ray tube. Consumers could choose from over 3 dozen models, costing from $150 to $1,000. In 1941, sound transmissions for television were transferred from AM to FM frequencies, where they remained. Both the video and audio signals were broadcast as an RF signal, and a single antenna was used. During its first year, the NBC station was on the air for an average of 2 hours a day, televising more than 1,000 programs. Television studios were set up with special lighting. The cameras, which were focused by the twist of a handle, were positioned so each one captured a different angle. The cameramen wore headphones so they could hear instructions from the director, who watched what the cameras were capturing on a monitor in the control room.
All right, switch to 1. Now roll into a close-up of the string section. Now pan across the orchestra from the brass to the strings. Now back to your original position and pan over to include the conductor.
On December 7, 1941, CBS broadcast the first televised newscast, reporting on the events at Pearl Harbor. The war subsequently slowed the development of television, but after the war, progress continued. By 1948, there were 36 television stations on the air and about 1 million sets in use. By 1950, more people watched television than listened to radio. The first color broadcast was made on June 12, 1951 by CBS. By the mid-1950s, television was a multi-billion-dollar advertiser-driven industry, with the three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, at the forefront. Television has made it possible for millions of people to share a single experience. 750 million people saw John F. Kennedy's funeral in 1963, and about 600 million people watched the first man walk on the moon in 1969. The impact that television has had on the world is immeasurable and profound. And it all started that day back in 1926, when the world got its first telecast of the future. May 20th, 1927, a day that captured the hopes and imagination of the world. History was made when Charles Lindbergh became the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Just after dawn, 25-year-old Lindbergh prepared for his flight in his Ryan NYP monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. He was ready to take off from Roosevelt Field in New York and begin his non-stop 3,600-mile flight across the Atlantic. Carrying 451 gallons of gasoline, the Spirit of St. Louis struggled to get off the ground. The plane was a conventional high-wing monoplane stripped of virtually all equipment, including radio and parachute, to make room for fuel. The key to Lindbergh's success and to the future of American aviation was the plane's engine. The new J5C Whirlwind was fitted with sodium-cooled valves and was the first in a series of very successful radial engines. Its speed averaged only 107 miles an hour, and sometimes Lindbergh dipped as low as 10 feet above the ocean waves. But as the fuel was used up and the plane got lighter, the Spirit of St. Louis climbed as high as 10,000 feet. Lindbergh battled fog and sleet over Newfoundland, crossed England and the Channel, and finally followed the Seine to Paris. The whole city was waiting for him. Finally, at 10 o'clock in the evening, 33 hours after he left New York, Lindbergh reported that he could see the lights of Paris. Hundreds of thousands turned out to greet him at Le Bourget Airport. Lindbergh said, "I appreciated the reception which had been prepared for me and had intended taxiing up to the front of the hangars. But no sooner had my plane touched the ground than a human sea swept toward it. I saw there was a danger of killing people with my propeller, and I quickly came to a stop." Lindbergh won a $25,000 prize for his nonstop flight, was hailed as a hero worldwide, and was honored with parades and awards. Lindbergh had loved aviation since childhood. He dropped out of the University of Wisconsin to attend a flying school. He apprenticed with a barnstormer until he bought his first plane in 1923 and began flying solo. The next year, he graduated from the U.S. Army Flying School in Texas and was commissioned second lieutenant in the Army Air Reserve Service. He left his job as a pilot for an airmail line to attempt the first non-stop New York to Paris flight. With his success, Lindbergh did a tremendous amount to promote aviation. He urged the creation of great airports and emphasized the wartime importance of airplanes. And people listened. Air travel grew steadily in popularity. Lindbergh's historic feat had fueled the public's imagination about flying. And on May 20th, 1927, who could have imagined that 42 years later, man would fly 238,000 miles to walk on the moon?
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world.
October 6, 1927, The Jazz Singer, the first talking motion picture, opened today, and the future of movie making was forever changed. The film starred Al Jolson, who appeared in blackface, a minstrel tradition. The film storyline partially reflected Jolson's real life. The movie was about a Jewish boy whose family frowned on his desire to be an entertainer. Jolson would always be remembered for his passionate rendition of Mammy.
Baby, I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles for my Mammy.
While silent films had used live music and sound effects, audiences were thrilled to hear real dialogue. Britain's first talkie was a film called Blackmail.
I shall have quite a lot to say. And the first thing I shall say is that she was there too.
Here the director of the thriller, Alfred Hitchcock, makes his traditional cameo appearance. While most of the film industry embraced the new technology, not everyone was convinced. In 1928, Joseph Schenck, president of United Artists, said talkies were a fad. He stated that people will not want talking pictures for long. He would, of course, be proven quite wrong. But there were silent film stars who did not make a successful transition to talking movies. The most notable was perhaps Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin believed that his popular character, the Tramp, would only be effective in pantomime. But overall, the movie industry saw the benefits in making talkies. Fox Film Corporation announced in 1929 that it would make musicals exclusively. Talking films helped the movie industry to grow. In 1929-30, there were 30 full-length and 52 short films produced, all of which were talkies.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, madam. And it is a good morning, with the birds singing in the air, heavy with the fragrance of 100 species of rampant flora. Oh, it's good to be alive, sir. Vibrant, tingling, full of animal spirits. Shut up!
From 1920 to 1929, movie attendance increased from 80 million people to 110 million people going to the movies each week. During the 20s and 30s, movie studios produced, distributed, and exhibited their films. But because of a 1948 antitrust law, the major companies agreed to give up one area. They chose exhibition, because the growing popularity of television was beginning to force movie theaters to close. But movies would always be a crucial part of culture, reflecting everything from major social events to personal journeys. And filmmaking was forever revolutionized by the introduction of the talkie on October 6, 1927.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee. I'd give the world to be among the folks in DIX. I even know my mammy's waiting for me.
September 15, 1928. At this very place, Alexander Fleming made a discovery that has saved countless lives: penicillin. Fleming was a bacteriologist working at the University of London School of Medicine. He discovered a bacteria-killing substance when he left a plate of Staphylococcus bacteria uncovered in his laboratory for several days. He noticed that the bacteria had died where an airborne mold had fallen on the dish. He identified the mold as penicillium, and he called the antibacterial byproduct penicillin. Fleming then found that penicillin was non-toxic and it inhibited the growth of many harmful bacteria. Penicillin works by interfering with the growth of the bacterial cell wall. The weakened cell wall eventually bursts, killing the bacteria. Although penicillin was discovered in 1928, it was not until 12 years later that two researchers at Oxford University, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, conducted a clinical trial. By 1946, penicillin was in general use. Penicillin has truly been a miracle drug. It is remarkably non-toxic to normal body cells, yet is still active against many of the most harmful bacteria, including the bacteria that cause syphilis and pneumonia. For his discovery of penicillin, Alexander Fleming shared the 1945 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine with the two scientists who studied it later. A wide range of antibiotics in the penicillin family have since been developed, and countless people have been cured or saved thanks to Fleming's discovery on September 15th, 1928. October 24th, 1929, disaster on Wall Street. The stock market crashed on a day that would go down in history as Black Thursday. Panicked investors ordered their brokers to sell their stocks at any price. Thousands of accounts were wiped out as a record number of shares, nearly 13 million, were traded. The stocks of major companies such as General Electric and Montgomery Ward plummeted. During the first 3 hours, stock valuations shrank over $11 billion. Stories of financial ruin and suicides were rampant. Although there was a rapid recovery that same afternoon, the crash started a panic which undermined vital confidence in the economy. As the market declined, the economy slid downward as a whole into the Great Depression. Within 3 years, 12 to 15 million Americans, about 1/4 of the labor force, was unemployed. And business productivity hit its lowest level. From 1929 to 1932, 11,000 banks, 44% of the total, failed in the United States, and nearly $2 billion in deposits evaporated. There were several theories about what caused the stock market and the economy to spiral downward. The bull market had been going strong through 1928, but prices had gone too high. The market was out of touch with economic reality as business activity slowed and profits declined. Even though the Federal Reserve tried to control interest rates, commercial banks and corporations were still lending money for speculation. As nations recovered from World War I, thousands of foreign investors had sold off their interest and began investing in their own countries. And then there was the intangible yet very real factor of psychology, economists predicting disaster, and the contagious panic of investors on Black Thursday who said, sell at any price. It ended up being a very high price indeed. The nation's economy would soon follow the stock market, spiraling down into a depression that would last well into the late 1930s. May 1st, 1931, the tallest building in the world opens its doors for business. The Empire State Building stretched nearly 1/4 of a mile into the air. Considered one of the most impressive engineering accomplishments of the 20th century, to many, the Empire State Building is also the greatest skyscraper ever built. New York bustled with activity in the early 1900s. The city had become the economic capital of the country. The booming economy created more jobs and the need for more office space. But space was a valued and scarce commodity in Manhattan, so the only direction left to build was up. Advances in building technology enabled structures to soar into the sky, giving birth to the modern skyscraper. But the need for more office space wasn't the only reason buildings grew skyward. Ego played an equally important role in creating the tallest skyscrapers. The height of the building became a corporate symbol of strength and success. Skyscrapers such as the MetLife Building, the Singer Tower, and the Woolworth Building literally dwarfed their neighbors. The skyscraper came to define New York City. Bold, independent, rich, and arrogant enough to flaunt it. It was in this atmosphere of economic confidence that the Empire State Building had its roots. John J. Raskob, the man behind General Motors, decided to build the tallest skyscraper in the world. He had both the resources and the political power to make it happen. Construction began March 17, 1930. Almost everything was prefabricated off-site to expedite the construction process. Steel workers assembled giant steel supports in factories miles from the city. At the site, fearless iron workers choreographed a high wire act hundreds of feet above the ground. Onlookers marveled at the daily daring displays of balance and brawn. Construction pushed the building up 4.5 stories a week. As the building grew, so did its reputation. In the middle of construction, however, Raskob discovered he had some competition. At 43rd Street and Lexington Avenue, Walter P. Chrysler was finishing the Chrysler Building, which would become the tallest building in the world, after Chrysler secretly constructed a decorative spire inside the building and raised it in the final days of construction. Raskob answered by adding a 200-foot dirigible mooring mast to the top of the Empire State Building. The mast would allow airships to dock atop the building. But more importantly, the extra 200 feet decisively secured the title of world's tallest for the Empire State Building. Raskob's mooring mast received a lot of publicity, but never an airship. Half-hearted attempts to dock dirigibles at the top of the Empire State Building proved futile. Hundreds of people working 7 days a week labored successfully to complete the building ahead of schedule. The tallest building in the world opened its doors May 1st, 1931. 102 floors, 1,250 feet tall. This building's remarkable height attracted people to its observation deck for the best view in the city. But unfortunately, the tall structure posed a threat to aircraft. In 1945, a B-25 crashed into the side of the building.
13 people at work in offices were killed instantly, 26 were injured. 2 days later, the 102-story building reopened. But the hole ripped in the Empire State remains a warning of the perils of low flying among skyscrapers.
The Empire State Building held the height record for an amazing 40 years before the World Trade Center, also in New York, took the title. During those 40 years, architects began using different building materials. Metal and glass replaced masonry facades. Sadly, the graceful Art Deco design of skyscrapers constructed in the 1920s and 30s was supplanted by the simple glass box buildings built after World War II. The golden age of skyscraper construction was over. But today, the Empire State Building remains more than a majestic reminder of a bygone era. It is still the symbol of New York City. March 1st, 1932. In the sleepy New Jersey town of Hopewell, the crime of the century was committed. America's aviation hero Charles Lindbergh made world news again when his 20-month-old son, Charles Jr., was kidnapped from the nursery of his home by an intruder. The only clues to the crime were a homemade ladder, some muddy footprints, and a ransom note for $50,000. The largest manhunt in American history was begun in hopes of finding the baby and the abductor. Even the Lindberghs joined the search.
Hello, everybody. We're speaking to you now from the General Store in Hopewell, New Jersey, the improvised press headquarters during the Lindbergh case. We have here a flash which reads as follows. If the kidnappers of our child are unwilling to deal directly,
the Lindbergh statement said that they would do whatever was asked for the safe return of their baby. More ransom notes were received and payments were made. One $50,000 payment was dropped over a cemetery wall by Lindbergh family friend Dr. John Condon, who heard the voice of the blackmailer. The baby, however, was never returned.
Despite the greatest manhunt in history, the baby's murder was not discovered until his little body was found here in the woods near his home 2 months later.
The discovery of the baby's body in May solved half the crime, but the kidnapper was still at large. Police and federal agents followed up countless leads, but it would be more than 2 years before an arrest of substance would be made in the case. Finally, in September of 1934, law enforcement officials released this stunning statement.
We have in custody the man who received the ransom money. His name is Bernard Richard Hauptmann, 1279 East 222nd Street, in the borough of the Bronx in the city of New York. He came to this country as a stowaway 11 years ago. He is an alien, unlawfully in the country. Will this solve the Lindbergh kidnapping? In the opinion of all three of us, yes.
In this garage across the street from the Hauptmann home, $13,750 of the ransom money shown here was found. 2 cans were stuffed with the gold certificates, and it was the passing of a gold certificate to Walter Lyle, a gas station attendant, that led to Hauptmann's arrest.
With the arrest of Hauptmann, the crime of the century now became the trial of the century. The prosecution, handled by no less than New Jersey's Attorney General, David Wylance, presented its case to the jury of 8 men and 4 women. America's leading newsmen, Walter Winchell and Damon Runyon, were among the 400 reporters that covered the case. Every word was recorded and sent around the world. With the physical evidence against Hauptmann on display, the jury saw a parade of witnesses, including Charles Lindbergh, Anne Lindbergh, and a collection of handwriting experts.
The evidence is unmistakable. Mr. Hauptmann might just as well have signed each one of these ransom notes. So convincing to my mind is the proof that he did write them.
Even with the flood of evidence, defense attorney Edward J. Riley was confident that he could prove Hauptmann's innocence.
Watch our witnesses. They will develop a perfect case for the defense.
But Hauptmann proved to be the weak link in his own defense. Under Wyland's tough cross-examination, he admitted a lie.
When you were arrested with this Lindbergh ransom money, you had a $20 bill. Lindbergh ransom money, did they ask you what it was about? Did they ask you? You did. Did you lie to them or did you tell them the truth? Did you lie to them or did you tell them the truth? I said nothing. You lied, didn't you? I did, yes.
New Jersey has rested its case, convinced that it has clearly established that the defendant, Hauptmann, came to the state of New Jersey on the night of March the 1st, 1932, that the ladder which he built, placed that ladder against the wall of the Lindbergh home and went into the Lindbergh home and murdered the child.
The jury returned with a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. After the trial, Charles and Anne Lindbergh moved to England. Hauptmann was sent to the electric chair, still denying his guilt. And the events of March 1st, 1932 would have lasting repercussions when Congress passed the Lindbergh Act, a law making kidnapping a federal crime. May 21st, 1932. Amelia Earhart flew into history when she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. Dubbed Lady Lindy in tribute to Charles Lindbergh, the 34-year-old Earhart's flight captured the hearts of millions as she piloted her red and gold Lockheed Vega from Newfoundland to Ireland in 15 hours and 39 minutes.
I've done it. Those were Lady Lindy's words when she got out of her machine in the field near the little village of Calmore. And all the villagers cheered her. Isn't she amazing? She doesn't look as though she's just battled with the elements for 2,000 miles in one of the most wonderful flights ever made, does she?
Amelia Earhart had been a pre-med student, nurse's aide, telephone operator, truck driver, social worker, lecturer, and writer. But her true love was aviation. She bought her first airplane in 1922, and 3 months later, she set a women's altitude record of 14,000 feet. Earhart had first gained prominence in 1928 when she had accompanied pilot Wilmer Stoltz on a flight across the Atlantic and became the first woman to cross the ocean by air. Even though the 29-year-old had logged over 500 hours solo flight time herself, on this trip she was relegated to the passenger seat. Flying in a multi-engine Fokker, they took off from Boston and landed in South Wales after a 22-hour flight. Their craft averaged slightly over 120 miles per hour. In London, Earhart was received by British society for her achievement and became an instant international celebrity. In 1937, Earhart was ready to pilot a flight around the world. She chose the most difficult route, 27,000 miles along the equator. She said, "I do it because I must do it. Women must try to do things men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be a challenge to others." Unfortunately, tragedy ensued. In the midst of Earhart's trip with experienced navigator Frederick Noonan, transmission was broken with the Coast Guard, and her plane was lost at sea. The world will long remember May 21st, 1932, when Amelia Earhart flew into history and challenged the aviation world and women to follow.